Thank you. Hey guys. Whoa. Who was at Jacob's talk yesterday about Smurf? So that's like 25% of you. That's cool, because this is going to be a different solution to a similar problem. Here it says that's going to be about HTML5, Sass, and CoffeeScript, which of course is total bullshit, because this talk is about Bob Ross. I'll dive a bit deeper into Bob Ross in a bit. Bob Ross was a painter from the US, and for a while I've been meaning to do a talk about Bob Ross. Turns out that if you submit proposals about Bob Ross talks to Ruby conferences, it's real hard to get accepted. So I just threw in some buzzwords like HTML5 and Sass, and it works a charm, so here we are. For those of you who don't know Bob Ross, this is Bob. Bob is this white guy sporting an afro, and the only one who could ever pull that off. And he's been dead for a while, like 15 years or so, or close to 20 years. He used to have this television show on PBS in the US, where he painted the painting in 30 minutes. And I call Bob the inventor of modular painting, because he had like this happy little tree and a crooked house and some clouds and whatnot. And he would take all those elements and reuse them over and over. But by just changing the composition, he changed his whole painting and created a new painting. And that's what we want to do with our applications as well. That's basically why a lot of you will use Bootstrap, to have all these reusable elements and create complete new pages by using all those recurring elements. So just like Bob, we like to start with a blank canvas. We're programmers. There's nothing better than starting a new project, because this time everything's going to go well. Like, you're not going to screw up. Like refactoring? Trust me, I'm a professional. So you start with this blank canvas, and for a few weeks you just start coding, and you go at it like Bob Ross riding a unicorn through a sky of rainbows. Just to illustrate it, everything exists on the internet. Just go to Google, enter Bob Ross unicorn rainbow, just like that. So you go at it like Bob Ross, and after a few weeks you take a step back to look at your code, and you expect something that looks like this immaculate Bob Ross painting. But instead you're greeted with something that looks more like a dead rat lying next to a puddle of cat vomit. So when you enjoy this picture for a bit, let me just take a sip of water. This is so gross. Okay, so what went wrong? You started writing your CSS, some H1 that needs to be black. Hey, that's all fun and games. This is perfectly okay. Oh wait, some occasions it needs to be blue and in italics. So you say, well, whenever it's inside some element with ID main or sidebar, we'll just have it look like this. Sure, no problem. Oh wait, for the Twitter widget, it needs to be red. So if the H1 is inside an element with a class Twitter, it needs to be red, which obviously doesn't work because of CSS specificity. So you need to add the bang important to make this work. Oh wait, for tweets in the sidebar, it needs to be green. Oh, you can fix it like this. This will work. Oh wait, except once. But you can just add like a class name to the H1, and this will work. So when you do it like this, you end up with code looking like dead rats lying next to puddles of cat vomit. So let's just fix it. Let's just fix this. As Bob would say, oh, you'd be in agony city by now. I'm not making this up. Go to bobrossquotes.com. Yes. There are plenty of wisdoms. Who needs old ancient Chinese sayings? bobrossquotes.com. A little bit about me. As introduced, I'm Roy Tomeij. Roy on Twitter. If you have anything to say about me or my presentation, please mention me so I can find you later and tell you we're wrong and things like that. I'm co-founder of ATBeans, a Ruby consultancy in Amsterdam, and co-founder of Slicecraft, which is a Oh yeah, you learn a thing or two here. So this is their website, Eielson Air Force Base, Alaska. This is their homepage, which is constructed entirely out of tables. Yes, that's US taxpayers' dollars at work. But then look at the page, look at these elements. Just like Bootstrap, you want to have something reusable, but you don't want your application to look like Bootstrap. There are way too many applications out there looking like Bootstrap. We use it all the time for admin interfaces and prototyping and things like that, but as soon as you have something consumer-facing, you may want to have something a bit more unique. So these are just all those elements that they should be able to reuse throughout your application. You can just take one element on the homepage, copy-paste it somewhere else, or use a partial, and it should still look the same. It shouldn't break. So that's the goal of this approach. Boop. So you have 3 sections. You have structure and styling and behavior. But we'll start with structure with HTML5. This is what we used to do with HTML4. HTML4 had this single H1, because that's good for Google. It's like SEO purposes. Then you have some div with ID sidebar, which apparently means it's secondary content. In there an H2, because you can't use an H1, because, hey, SEO. Then an article, which is a div with a class article with an H3 in there. This isn't too reusable. Luckily, we have HTML5 now, where you can use multiple H1s and elements with more semantic meaning. And I strongly believe in writing semantic markup, so I would say use those new semantic elements. So in this case, we have an H1 with an aside, which tells us it's secondary content. In there's an H1, because, hey, we can have multiple H1s. An article with, again, an H1. Now, there are new sectioning elements like aside and article and section and header, and there are a bunch more. But you don't want to go replace all your diffs. Some diffs are just diffs, so use them in a meaningful way. All sections can start with an H1. And it makes them great partials. Because when you first need to keep track of, well, I have this partial with an H2 in there, I can only use it in my application, or an H3 in there, I can only use it somewhere in this hierarchy where it's below an H2. That made it real hard to reuse those bits of HTML. When using H1s, you can just take the HTML, use it everywhere, and it will just work. Because according to the spec, you're allowed to use an H1. Start with an H1 in each sectioning element. These new HTML5 elements don't work well in older browsers. And with older browsers, of course, I mean any IE up to date. So you need something to fix that. You need the HTML5 chef, or preferably you'll be using Modernizer anyway for feature detection, which can include the HTML5 chef, so you can actually style those elements in crappy old browsers as well. About using these multiple H1s, are there any SEO experts right here? Because a few weeks ago someone actually raised his hand. The guy hates me now. SEO experts will tell you to use a single H1. Because A, that's for SEO purposes. That's like what Google needs and what Google likes. So I submit a website, tell them, hey, sure, you can check this out. And they're like, oh no, there are like 15 H1s in a single page. Like, yeah, sure. So then an SEO expert will ask, can you fix that? I'm like, yeah, sure. So how many should I use? Then the most common answer is less. Okay. Like, well, how many? Like, yeah, no, 5, 6. So apparently they have no clue, which makes sense, or there's been research, and Google itself has actually been saying since 2009 that it's okay to use multiple H1s, even when using HTML 4.1 and 4.01 and not using HTML5. So screw those SEO experts. They know crap. They're just in the business of getting rich of your clients. So fuck them. Just use those multiple H1s. You can do anything you want to do. This is your world. And while I take another sip of water, let's just enjoy this Bob Ross masterpiece. This is awesome. So, on with modular CSS. So we have our structure now, we have our HTML. We need some styling too, otherwise it's going to look a bit boring. So where to start? First, you need a proper designer. I know a lot of designers who, or basically most designers, still think in pages. They will design 5 pages with elements that may occur on various pages. And it's not unlikely that they, for some reason, won't copy-paste their stuff or use layer comps in Photoshop or whatever, but just use the same element but make it slightly different. A few pixels more padding or a slightly different shade of blue. That's not going to work, because if you want reusable elements, they need to look the same everywhere. So find a designer that gets it. Now, I like to kill trees by printing my designs, so I just print all those pages, put them up on a wall, take a Sharpie or some other marker, and just look at the first one, look at the second one, and on the second one, just cross out any module that already exists on the first one. So in the end, you'll end up with only the modules that need to be coded, because those are the unique ones throughout your application or throughout the design. If you don't like killing trees, you can kill kittens or something. So you want to determine these common elements, and we have an existing project. You may want to throw out your existing code. This is where I used to stop in my talk about doing this, like refactoring. No, just throw out your stuff. And then someone walked up to me and was like, yeah, Roy, but we've been working on this app with a team of 5 for 2 years, and we don't really feel like throwing out all our code. And well, that kind of made sense. So keep your current code, but refactor. So I believe that clean code goes in clean files. With front end, that's pretty handy. Just copy paste whatever you will be reusing to a new file, and in the end you'll end up with an empty old file or an old file you can delete entirely. I will give a module a new class name, so there is no tie whatsoever to the old CSS, so I'll be only copy pasting, because copy pasting rules still. I'll be only copy pasting actual CSS properties and no class names, etc. So there will be no clash between the old and the new CSS. Find similar modules. So you may have a module that is used on multiple pages. Well, just use the new CSS structure and maybe your new slightly modified HTML structure, and request some leeway to normalize. In the past, you may have implemented, or someone else may have implemented, this design which was slightly different on various pages. That's not going to work anymore, so request some leeway to make some executive decisions on that exact shade of blue and that 11 or 10 pixels padding and things like that. So when writing code, each module gets its own scope. We'll get to code in a bit. I'll start all my class names with mod dash to indicate that it's a module, which makes it real handy to identify where a module starts and where it ends in your CSS as well as your HTML. You have some section with a class mod dash something. That means that from the opening tag for that element using the mod dash class name until the closing tag of that element, that will be a complete module. Use generic class names. If you have a list of articles, you can just call it news until you want to use the same styling in half a year for best read items 5 years ago. And news doesn't cut it anymore. So come up with something generic. Use articles or blog posts or whatever. But don't limit yourself to what you think may be a good idea right now but won't be in the near future. And use shallow selectors. CSS specificity is a bitch. The longer your selector, the more specific it is, depending on using element selectors or IDs or classes and whatever. The more specific it gets, the harder it is to override, and the more pain you will have when trying to reuse a module and it's still looking different in various places. So some HTML that goes with that, and some CSS. So here we have a section with the class mod dash articles. In there's an H1. There's an article, obviously, which has a heading again, which is an H1. At the bottom is Sass. You may recognize from yesterday from Jacob's talk. This is the original Sass syntax. You also have this crappy SCSS syntax, which reintroduces semicolons and curly brackets. Yeah, we're not going back there. Anyway, as for the scoping, there's this mod-articles in the CSS, and everything else is indented one level underneath it. So this only applies to articles within the element with the class name mod-article. For me, this is a great way to predict behavior, predict styling on being applied just to a single element. This is what you shouldn't do. So maybe you have this module that looks a certain way, but when you use it in some different context, it needs to look slightly different. In this case, we want to have a width of 50% instead of the default 100%. If you do it like this, this works. This is for a articles module in your aside. This works perfectly fine until you need to implement this somewhere else. And you'll just end up adding a second selector, something, space, mod-articles. And you can just keep adding stuff to your module to make it work everywhere. So don't do that, because you'll be reintroducing this world of herd. So what I like to do is use a second class name. A second class name that describes the difference. So in this case, there's a mod articles. When you use a second class name, in this case narrow, it will use the width of 50%. This you can use everywhere. This will not bite your other CSS. This just works because this uses the parent selector, the ampersand. This only kicks into effect when it's paired with the mod-articles class name. So you can use .narrow somewhere else using the same approach, and it won't bite each other. Now you also have what I call components. Components are things that you are likely to reuse inside your modules, like buttons or form elements or things like that. For that, I like to use super shallow selectors. Again, the more specific they get, the larger the world of herd you get in. So make them super shallow and don't limit them to specific HTML selectors. A lot of people still do something like input.something in their CSS if they want to style an input element of the type submit, for instance. That works, but maybe you in the future will have some link that you want to have to look like a button. That doesn't work, so just use .button in your CSS and you can just apply the class name to a multitude of various elements. Now for these components, I'll again like to describe the difference in the second class. And this is going to be unconventional, because this is going to be totally unsemantic, because I'm using the class name blue here to indicate that something's blue. And of course, we'll always hear your CSS naming or naming in general should have semantic value as well. So here it just says blue. Is that wrong? I don't know. It depends. My rule of thumb is the first class name should be descriptive. Should say, hey, there's a button. And the second one, for the second one, it's okay to just describe the difference. Because what I've seen, what people usually would do is, well, I have this red button, but when it's a submit button, I want it to be blue. So I'll just give the class name submit and add the class name to the button, the HTML, and it works. But then a half a year later, someone else comes and he has some other button he wants to be blue, and just calls it submit, and that works. I think that's even worse, because then you end up with adding semantic value to elements that have a different meaning. So you call some random button you want to be blue, you call that a submit button. So to me, this is perfectly acceptable, but if you say this is the ugliest thing ever, apart from rats and cat vomit, that's totally fine. So what does it look like in HTML? Again, the articles module, which has a button in there with the class button, and there's a blue button as well, which has a secondary class name. Nothing fancy. So components are basically always used within modules. Now sometimes you have this one exception. You have your buttons that look the same everywhere except for inside a specific module. So what I would do is extend this in that module. So within the mod articles module, just nest a button class in there and override its value. This will work because of the shadow selector we used for the button. This is more specific, so this will just turn green. If you find yourself using this green button multiple times, you find yourself copy-pasting this to various modules, you should seriously consider adding the second class name and yanking it out of your modules. Now, media queries. Those of you who are not too familiar with media queries, they allow you to only apply certain styling, certain CSS, based on certain conditions, such as min width or max width of the viewport or height or retina, things like that. For that, I strongly suggest using the power of Sass, which means you can nest a media query inside a selector, and Sass will just work it out and do what it needs to do to make proper CSS out of it. This way, your media queries are closely tied together with your modules. And yes, it does mean that, like in this case, max width 400 pixels, you may have something that changes in 3 different modules. When the max width is 400 pixels, you end up with using the same media query 3 different spots and 3 different modules. Is that dry? I don't know. Does it give you a great overview of which styling is tied to which module? Yes, I think it does. Now, this is not OOCSS, which is a crappy name anyway, because there's nothing object-oriented about CSS, nor is it SMAX, what Smurf is largely based on, because I use less class names in HTML and more element selectors. I like doing it this way because I often write front-end code, which then goes to back-end developers, and I will never touch it again. I often hear that found out that they like to just add a few class names or change a few class names and have stuff work instead of adding class names to every element, to the heading, to a paragraph, to whatever's in there. So you just like stuff to work, basically. So that's what I try to facilitate doing it like this. There's been discussion about, well, isn't this slower, like parsing CSS right to left, CSS selectors, element selectors are slower to parse than class selectors or IDs, which is completely true. I have no idea if it's still slower. No one has done any benchmarks on this for a while. There's an article on the Mozilla Developer Network that people usually refer to as the guideline for, hey, this is going to be, they did a test and it turns out that it's way slower. That article is from April of the year 2000. It was 8 years before Google Chrome came out, 4 years before Firefox 1, and 3 years before Safari. I don't know what it tested on. Netscape 4.6. I don't know. So I don't believe there's a huge disadvantage. I've been doing it like this for a while, also on mobile devices, and I haven't had any issues with the amount of time it takes to parse a CSS selector. So as long as we don't have actual benchmarks, actual metrics, I care about what I call to be a non-argument because it's a hypothetical disadvantage. So no OOCSS, no SMAX, but hey, something new because we didn't have enough approaches. When doing it like this, it does mean you need to refactor all the fucking time. Thanks to Anthony Eden, who was here last year as well, for this line. When I use class names, as in SMAX, use class names and it just works. When using descendant selectors, element selectors, you may style a certain H1 away and it works perfectly well until you add a second H1 and they both look the same. Maybe that's not what you wanted. So that means you need to refactor. Whenever you change your HTML, you need to check your CSS. Of course, you need to check, does it look okay? And you may need to refactor and fix stuff. So RATFT. Now this is the hardest part of this method. A lot of people have a hard time defining those modules. They say, well, this whole page is a module. No, it most likely isn't. Or this paragraph is a module. No, it most likely isn't. It's possibly there's some middle ground to be found there about what a module is. But it's not an exact science, so it's just about using common sense and develop a sense for modularity over time, I guess. If you can do this, you can do anything. And yes, it's water drinking time again. Bob actually never sold any of his paintings. They were all given away to various PBS stations across the country. And they're quite expensive nowadays if you can buy one and find one and buy one. I'd love one. So if any of you ever see a Bob Ross painting on eBay or whatever, mention me on Twitter. A huge bounty awaits you. So we've had HTML for markup, CSS for styling, but we have some behavior thrown in as well in the form of JavaScript. To me, a JavaScript module is closely coupled with a CSS module. Not coupled in the sense that they overlap each other with selectors and things like that, we'll dive into a bit later. But if there's a mod-articles, there's also, for CSS, there's also a mod-articles for JavaScript. Now, I use class names exclusively for CSS and use IDs exclusively for JavaScript. Because I'm okay, I can get around it to having a direct relation between my HTML and my CSS, and my HTML and my JavaScript, but I don't want any relation necessarily between my CSS and my JavaScript, because things are complicated enough already. So as you see here, this article section will have a class name and an ID, both called mod-articles. And then you can call some jQuery on it, just find the element with that ID and do stuff. Like I said, I don't use IDs in CSS because I think using IDs is evil. What I've seen is that people will use testing frameworks for JavaScript, which makes complete sense, and they test the hell out of their HTML structure and the behavior of the application, but testing your styling is still close to impossible. So what you see is that you have an ID that's used in your JavaScript and your CSS to show this tiny icon somewhere with some elements. Someone changes this HTML and the JavaScript test breaks, and they fix the JavaScript and the test works, and no one notices this tiny icon is gone because there's no testing for styling. I believe when using IDs exclusively for JavaScript and class names for CSS, you can completely avoid that issue. Sometimes you just want to target multiple arguments in your CSS. IDs need to be unique, so you can only have a single ID. Well, you can have multiple IDs on a page, but they all need to be unique. If you want to target multiple elements, you could just find elements by class name in JavaScript. Since we're not doing that anymore, we need to come up with a replacement, so I went for data attributes. New in HTML5, just make something up. In this case, here's Bob, who was married to Linda, and he had a son called Steve. Steve and Bob are both males, Linda's a female, so we have a data-sex attribute. In production, I'd likely use data-gender, but it didn't fit the line, and I like saying sex in public. So data-sex. And you can just find those elements with jQuery. If you want to find all males, just do it like this. It's a simple attribute selector, data-sex equals male. If you want to find any gender, just find all elements that have a data-sex attribute. I'm saying it again. And if you want to do it faster, scope it to a certain type of elements. So in this case, if you know they're only going to be LIs, if you do it like this, it will be slightly faster. So I wrote a blog post about this in January. And these were the comments. People were saying this was going to be so slow, especially in older browsers and mobile devices, and this was not going to work, and I was essentially just killing the internet. And then I thought, well, I haven't accomplished that much in my life. If killing the internet is like one of the things I actually did, that could be cool. But I thought they were wrong, so I just created a test case. Well, first, for a few months, I told everyone, you're wrong, because I know I'm a professional. And then I actually started testing, and luckily, the outcome of the test was favorable for me. So what did I do? I took the CNN.com homepage, which has over 1,300 HTML elements, to each li and each div in there, which were 751, I added class names of gender and male and gender and female, evenly distributed, and I added those data gender class names. And I ran some tests. I went to jsperf.com if you want to run this test or see how it works. roy.io/data test for the details. So I ran the tests, and what you see here is the number of operations it can do per second. So finding elements by class name on the left and finding elements by data attribute on the right. This is on this huge DOM of over 1,300 elements, which is 750 matching elements. Chrome could do this 922 times per second. So that's around 10 milliseconds. No, even less, 1. Class names are faster, but using data attributes is only 4.9% slower. Safari, slightly slower, but still the difference isn't too great. Android 4 even, which surprisingly is faster than iOS 5 on a new iPad. The difference the differences aren't that big. Then of course IE, 67% slower. That's surprising, but still, if you look at the slowest one here, which is iOS 5, it can still do 55 operations per second. Now, often we want to target a whole bunch of elements in HTML to append or to bind some JavaScript events to them or whatever. If you can do that 56 times per second, imagine a user coming to your website, even on Android or iOS, and it takes like 20 milliseconds to bind those JavaScript events, they won't notice. So right here, right now, I've debunked the myth of data attributes being slower, being way slower than class names. So this actually works. Now, when you go using those data attributes instead of class names, people might look at you a bit funny, but it's okay. I'm used to it. Thanks, Bob. So, structure, styling, behavior, but we need to put that code somewhere, right? So we have to discuss file structure. I use a single Sass file per module because it makes sense, because you can easily find stuff. If you have a module called mod-articles, you just know that in my style sheets directory there's a file called articles.sass or .css.sass in the asset pipeline. I do the same for CoffeeScript, use a single file per module. I would like to use a partial per module, but in the end, you often end up with actually copy-pasting your HTML. You don't want to put everything in partials. Ideally, I'll have any page and only see like render calls in there, nothing else. There can be a lot of I/O, and you may consider not doing that, but it would clean things up. And Sprockets isn't always right, but we'll get into that a bit later. So, style sheets. This is what my structure looks like, my directory structure. So you have base, which has layout and things like that, which the rest depends on. You have components, buttons, form elements, etc. And you have actual modules, which can be a header, article module, and there can be a lot of them. I have applications which have maybe close to 100 modules. Those can be divided into subfolders as well. So you can have a directory inside modules and group your modules there, whatever works for you. Well, this is what a Sass file looks like. I like resetting my stuff, so I use Compass for everything. So I just first import Compass, the Compass reset, then import everything in base, components, and modules. Because when you do it like this, you're sure that your base stuff is loaded first, your components second, and your modules last. So you don't run into issues of being them imported in a random order. JavaScript, same thing. Components, modules, exact same structure. So for Sass, I didn't use sprockets. If you use sprockets in Sass, all those files will live in their own scope, and if you define a variable or a mix-in in one file, it won't be accessible in the other, so use Sass imports for those. Sprockets is fine for your JavaScript or CoffeeScript. So again, I like to use jQuery, require 3 components, modules, and that just works. So I believe that if you do things like this, your code will look like this. Well, the little clock on the wall says we're just about out of time. But we do have time for questions. So while you think about a few, I just want to say that this is the 8th time I'm doing this talk in Western, Eastern Europe and the US. It's going to be the last time, and I'm kind of sad. It's like saying goodbye to an old friend. So I'd just like to say, thank you, Bob. Slides are online, roy.io/AC12 for RCamp. Excuse me, ArrrrCamp. You can find me online. And if you have questions, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
On the first slide where you show an example of a module, you show module article with then class specified under that narrow. And contrary to Bootstrap, you do not repeat the name of the class above it, so it's not module article narrow as a name. Is there a specific reason why you do that? Because I can easily imagine if another module is in the DOM underneath this module and it's also narrow, that its total width will then be 25% of what it should be, well, taking the full visual width. That's going to create problems, or is there a specific reason why you don't do that?
Okay, so let me repeat. If you, I think it was about nesting modules, right? You have your modules within a module. And they both have this narrow class, will that bite, so will you in the end with using width 50% twice, will you end up with your inner module having a width of 25%, right? I don't nest modules. Because if you start nesting modules, you get into a world of hurt often because you need to override stuff that's defined by the outer module. So what I do have is, and I didn't discuss this here, is basically what Jacob covered yesterday. I also have files for layout, which have layout definitions, which use layout-something for class name. I would use those for layout, and that's what I would actually use the width in nowadays. But I try to fit it in this 40-minute space. So if you do it exactly like this and you want to prevent that problem from happening, don't nest modules, because that's what I basically never do. Well, this narrow class only kicks in when it's called in combination with the articles class. So only when both classes are called. So not just the narrow, but when they both are called.
You can easily imagine another component or something else also using narrow. Because you're not saying that this is specifically how narrow should behave within this module. You're just saying this is narrow if it's somehow underneath my module. If it comes from a component or from anything else.
No, this was specifically tied to that module. So in the CSS, it would be .mod-articles.narrow without a space in between. So only when you call the combination of those two class names, that kicks into effect. Okay. Well, that should have been an awesomely quick answer. You need to paraphrase that for me. So how do I handle two modules that are basic, which look a lot alike, or?
Within a module, you might have, within two modules, you might have common styles, or even within components, components that that have similar features and that you would like to extract at some point so that you don't have to for dryness.
Yeah. So that's the refactor all the fucking time, basically. When you get this component that is almost the same, you can add this second class name. That's what I did with blue. When it diverges from that and it's getting too different, I'd say just use that's the time you need to start refactoring and maybe create two different components, which may be slightly alike and you may be repeating yourself. But repeating myself a little, I feel, is better than not having a clear picture of what my CSS and HTML looks like. So yes, it will be less dry, maybe.
What's the advantage of refactoring if you can add a class name and don't?
Exactly that. What's the benefit of refactoring when you can add a class name and don't? Because you'll be adding class names and not refactoring. So you end up with, possibly in the end, with class names you won't be using, which are still parsed by a browser. And I don't like appending class names to everything basically because of that reason. We have a heading and we have a slightly different heading, and then we create a second class name. Then in the end, the first class name isn't used anymore anywhere in the application and is not written. I believe that it goes for whatever you do with code, you should be refactoring all the fucking time. And with this, it's more heavily, you need to do it like more heavily than with OOCSS or SMAX, for instance. That's true. But that's a personal preference, I guess. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm a bit surprised they're not using tools like REUSABLE to isolate their modules, so you're doing like reusable modules and everything. So is it correct?
Sorry, you need to speak up a little, I think. So I don't use?
REUSABLE, Java tools for like doing modularization and isolation for modules for JavaScript. Is it correct?
Not really. This is just something we settled on that worked well for us, and which doesn't require a lot of knowledge of external tools. For what we often do with SliceCraft is we architecture designs. We get a design, we create front-end architecture for that, ship the code, and we don't want to write too much documentation. So doing it like this, there's just this clear combination of CSS and JavaScript and naming conventions, and there definitely are other ways to go, and I'm totally fine with people doing a hype, like taking what they believe are the good parts of this and then implement other stuff. But we're just doing this because this, for us, turned to work out well with external parties mostly. Anyone?
Do you have any rules or set of best practice for refactoring, or just while rearranging articles?
Yeah, it's mostly rearranging and changing selectors and maybe cutting a module. If you have a module which has like, we have narrow, but if you have 5 exceptions, you may be looking at like, is this module like is the scope too big? Should I cut it up into smaller modules or into similar modules which may be less dry, but is better readable? So it's basically common sense. I have no rules for about how to refactor. No. Yeah. So yeah, that's a hard thing about testing front-end or testing styling, testing CSS. How do you check if everything's okay after refactoring? Yeah, you need to have a testing monkey that clicks through your application and sees what works and what doesn't. So what I like to do is have one page which has all the modules. So when I make a change, I know it will be reflected on that one single page. That does mean that you shouldn't nest your modules, otherwise it could look okay on this one page and it could look like total crap on another page because of inheritance. But if you use all those modules separately and have them on a single page, that kind of works. And I've been chatting with a few guys at Pivotal Labs recently about seeing if we can do something with screenshots and matching those and that kind of stuff, but it's really painful, so that may be a long time before you get there. So manual labor, basically. So if there's nothing else, then I'll say have a great lunch, and thanks for listening.